Good day. My name is H.B. Charles, the pastor teacher at Shiloh Church in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm the author of the books On Preaching and On Pastoring, and I also write a blog that you can find at hbcharlesjr.com, along with other resources. I'm glad in this conversation to have with me a friend and a brother who has spent much time promoting and encouraging and training biblical preaching. So I'm glad to have my friend Michael Diduit here for another conversation on our website. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and thanks for hosting us this week.
Oh, it's been a joy. So for those who do not know you, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background.
Well, I have been in ministry for more years than I can count.
Sure.
But have worked at Southern Seminary, worked at Samford University, Palm Beach Atlantic University, Union University. Have been at Anderson University since 2008. And had the privilege of being able to establish the College of Christian Studies and the Clamp Divinity School.
Wow.
I've served as a pastor, associate pastor, youth pastor, made the rounds, and but it's exciting at this stage in my ministry being able to equip and train a next generation.
That's great. So let's start from the beginning. Where are you from?
Was born in Illinois, about 60 miles west of Chicago, on a farm. My family moved to Florida when I was in third grade, Merritt Island, Florida. Lived in various spots up and down the east coast of Florida. Finally finished here in Jacksonville at high school. Yeah. And then went to Stetson University. Went to seminary in Louisville at Southern Baptist Seminary. And did my PhD at Florida State.
When you went to Stetson in college, what were you planning on studying, or were you already pointed toward ministry then?
I was already pointed toward ministry. I had committed my life to, I had a sense of call to ministry when I was in high school, and wasn't sure what area of ministry it was going to be. At one point, I was thinking it might be in media, kind of Christian media, which is, interestingly enough, it's turned out to be a big part of my ministry. But went to Stetson. By the time I left Stetson going to seminary, I assumed it was going to be the pastoral ministry. And so went to seminary. Once I got there, they actually hired, since I'd been editor of the student newspaper at Stetson, they hired me as news director of the seminary. And that sort of set a new path for my ministry. For many years, my ministry ended up being a big focus on communication and that whole side of organizational, institutional life.
Sure. So when would you say you trusted Christ? At what age?
I made a profession of faith as a 6-year-old. Sure. When we were still in Illinois. But what I consider my true experience with Christ was when I was 12 years old, and we were living in Greensboro, North Carolina. Members of the Florida Street Baptist Church there. Bill Glass, the former NFL player, came and did a crusade. Bill Glass was a popular preacher, did a crusade, and while I was there, I had a sense that my life was not where it needed to be, and made a commitment to Christ at that point, and gave my life to the Lord.
Praise God. So at 15, you sense a call to preach on your life, and there's a pointing toward training. Alongside of that process, personally, who are the preachers that you are hearing that are influencing you early? What is your understanding of preaching from what you're exposed to at that time? Well,
I was privileged to have be in churches with some great preachers, none greater than Adrian Rogers.
Oh yeah.
We were members of First Baptist Church Merritt Island. Wow. When Adrian was the pastor there. And so in some of those formative years, I was watching one of the great preachers in America, and really influenced me in terms of the power of preaching. Sure. And what could be done. And then over the years had other great preachers at the seminary. As working as news director, I had opportunity to go to conventions and get to hear great preachers. I got to meet and interview preachers like W.A. Criswell and folks like that. And so I guess early on the Lord was shaping me with a sense of the power and significance of preaching.
So you or Dr. Moeller have mentioned that you all served at a paper together. Is that?
Well, what we did was when I was actually at Southern Seminary on staff as communications director, when I actually launched Preaching Magazine.
Okay.
And Dr. Moeller's office, he was still a graduate student, was 2 doors down from me in the development office.
Yeah.
And we got to be friends at that time. And so as I was starting the magazine, I brought him along side, and he served as associate editor of the magazine. That very first Southern Baptist Convention, it's 1985 Dallas Convention. Who knew it was going to be the all-time record convention?
Sure.
We had published the very first issue. My parents drove from Jacksonville to Dallas with a U-Haul trailer full of 9,000 magazines. And Al Moeller and I stood out on the sidewalk.
Wow.
We actually originally were inside, but they chased us out to the sidewalk. We stood out there and distributed 9,000 copies of Preaching Magazine.
Yeah.
And that was really the launch.
Wow, that's a great story.
I sure wish I had a picture of him standing out there giving out magazines.
That would be great. So what, do you remember what you featured in the first?
Billy Graham.
Well, that's where you start.
Billy, you might as well start at the top. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Billy Graham was on the cover of that very first issue in one of his sermons.
Wow, that's great.
In fact, a couple of years later, Dr. Moeller mailed copies. Now, this is before he's president of the seminary.
Sure.
He had some entrepreneurial ideas even then. He mailed 2 copies of the magazine to Mr. Graham and asked if he would autograph them for us.
Yeah.
And sure enough, he autographed both copies and came back. And so I think I'm sure he's still got that one. I've got that autographed copy on my wall.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So tell us about Preaching Magazine. This has been a part of your life and ministry for 30 years. Yeah. And for persons who may not be familiar with it, tell us what the vision for it was and what you've tried to accomplish with this magazine over these decades now.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to that sense of call to pastoral ministry, which the Lord redirected me into communications at that stage, although I served as a pastor. In addition to that, I served as interim pastor roles. I was an associate pastor for a while. But while I was in graduate school at Florida State, doing my work on the history of American preaching, I got involved as a job with an advertising agency where they had me working with trade journals. And so I got experience with the trade journal idea. One day, my minister of music and I was associate pastor at the time, we went to lunch for barbecue. Some of the best ideas come over barbecue.
Absolutely.
And we were sitting having one of those, what do you want to be when you grow up conversations? And in the process, I said, I want to start a trade journal for preachers. And later I started thinking, maybe that's not so far-fetched. I had that background with the seminary and pastoring, had now the experience with the trade journal. So I spent about a year researching, getting ready, studying the whole area. And then in 1985, in the meantime, I had moved to Southern Seminary as communications director. When they talked to me about coming, I told them, I said, look, I'm going to be launching this magazine. If that's a problem, let me know and I won't come. And they said, oh, no, that's fine. And so I was actually in Louisville when launching the magazine.
Wow.
And it really, the original idea was a trade journal for preachers. There was nothing quite like that. There was Leadership Journal, but that was kind of broad-based ministry. There were some denominational publications, but in terms of, I used to laugh and say that preaching was sort of Leadership Journal with a niche.
Sure. Okay.
And that's really what it was. The goal was to provide a resource for evangelical preachers to help both equipping and also resourcing them. And it's been exciting to see what happened. As I said, we gave out those first copies at the Southern Baptist Convention, did an original mailing. The nice thing was, because of my background in communications, I didn't have to hire out a lot of help. And so we did an original mailing and got about 1,500 charter subscribers. And that was really the launching pad. The other side was the contributing editors. I knew that nobody knew me from Adam. And so fact, they knew Adam much better. And so I knew that I would need some people who would lend their support to this. And so I kind of made a list of some of the preachers that I knew that were at kind of high profile. I visited with some other pastors, especially from other denominations. I would sit down with a Presbyterian pastor, Methodist pastor, and say, who are the preachers in your faith community that people be attracted to? And I assembled a list. I felt like I needed about 25 names of people that would serve as contributing editors. So I assembled a list of about 30. So I said, okay, I'm going to mail this first set of letters, telling them the vision, what I have in mind. And I said, out of this first group, we'll probably get 5 or 6 that'll sign on, and then I'll mail some more letters. We'll get another 5 or 6, and over a process. I mailed that first group of 30, and 25 signed on.
Wow.
So that was, to me, an affirmation that the Lord was behind this. Because, again, none of them knew who I was.
Yeah.
But they heard what the vision was and were willing to be a part of it. And some of those are still with me.
Oh, that's great. That is great. So a feature of the magazine over the years has been not only the articles on preaching, but interviews with great preachers, noted preachers, respected preachers. It would be fair. I feel like I can't find a fair way to ask this question, but what are memorable interviews? I know you can't say best or something like that, but are there any persons you got a chance to interview that just sticks with you as meaningful for any reason?
Yeah. Well, a lot of times it's, in some of those cases, it's just meeting that person.
Sure.
That was just a great experience. John Stott.
Yeah.
People like that. I remember interview with Chuck Swindoll being really meaningful as he talked about the role of the Holy Spirit in preaching. And sometimes it's a topic that they get into. That's probably been the biggest blessing of doing the magazine, is the opportunity to meet and talk to so many of these pastors.
Yeah.
I enjoyed, for example, years later, getting to go back to Adrian Rogers, who had been my pastor as a young person.
Yeah.
Now, years later, getting to go back and visit with him and do an interview with him. That was a special kind of coming back around to where I'd started.
Sure, that's great. So, what, for better or for worse, would you say has been the changes over the 30 decades from your perch in preaching?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there is for one thing, there's a greater emphasis on exposition.
Does that surprise you?
Not really.
Okay.
Not really. It's a positive sign, I think. I remember, I'm old enough to remember in the 60s when people were pronouncing the death of preaching.
Yeah.
There were people saying, there's no future for this. Somebody standing up on a stage and speaking to people that obviously we need to do, more dialogue and other kinds of things. And so people were pronouncing that preaching had no future. And so one of the intriguing things has been to see the resurgence of preaching. The fact that increasingly we recognize that not only does the church have a future, but preaching has a future. Seeing that growing emphasis on exposition. I think the work of people like Haddon Robinson and Brian Chappell, Stephen Olford, people like that have been influential in helping to kind of relaunch exposition, which, we could track back to John A. Broadus in the 19th century, but there's been this wonderful rebirth of exposition.
Yeah.
Even now, things like the Evangelical Homiletic Society that reflect people who teach in our seminaries and our colleges and overwhelmingly have a commitment to teaching biblical exposition in a way that just wasn't there. I had an opportunity to go teach back at Southern Seminary a number of years ago, teaching an expository preaching class. I was the first person to ever use Haddon Robinson's book.
Wow.
In that. And so there's been an enhanced understanding of that. I think one of the other things that certainly we've seen impact preaching is technology. Just some of the tools that are available now. both for preparation and presentation.
Sure.
You know, I mean, when I was a young pastor, you know, the idea of projecting things on a screen, you know, at most that might be your Sunday night Bible study. You'd have an overhead projector and a screen, but now technology has become a big part of it, and the resources that are available for the preacher in doing sermon preparation, the kind of software like the Logos and Word Search and those kinds of resources that are there, and the e-books and things. You know, I used to tote around a big bag of books, and now literally, if I go on a plane, I carry a book and my iPad, and everything is there already.
Sure.
So those are some of the really interesting things that are impacting preaching.
Wow. So you mentioned a couple of names. If you're talking to a budding preacher, a new preacher, and you are pointing them to books to help them understand the craft. You mentioned these names, but I assume you're going to repeat them, but why? For instance, you mentioned Olford, Robinson, and Chappell.
Yeah.
I would say those were top books you would recommend on preaching.
Well, for example, Southwestern Seminary does an interview podcast, and they do on their website. They asked me recently, they're doing a series of, you know, what's the one book every preacher should read? Yeah. And they asked me to do one of those, and I mentioned Haddon Robinson's book, Biblical Preaching, which is now in its 3rd edition. It's been such an influential book. Yeah. I think it published about just over maybe 35 years ago, the first time, but it has helped to shape a couple of generations of young preachers in college and seminary preaching classrooms. The idea of kind of methodically how you would go about step by step creating an expository sermon. That kind of resource has been so helpful. Brian Chappell kind of built on that with some of his resources. Dr. Olford, of course, has wrote great books, but even as much as anything, just his model of exposition, which influenced people like E.K. Bailey, for example. And one of the great resources now, in addition to the books that are there, is the fact that on the internet, we can listen to great expositors, people like Ralph West and Robert Smith Jr. and others that are just John MacArthur, Chuck Swindoll. The access to hearing these people is something that just wasn't available 30 years ago. Sure.
How would you commend or comment on some books that maybe a generation or two were considered key works at this point? What do you feel like the current role of Preaching and Preachers, Lloyd Jones and Stott? Do you still commend those works, or do you feel like the ones you mentioned as a Robinson would be a starting place and maybe work back to those?
Well, I think I would go with somebody like Robinson Chappell as a starting point, but books like Lloyd Jones are timeless. Sure. There's great value in those. And what was the other one you just mentioned?
Stott, Between Two Worlds.
We see in our Doctor of Ministry in Biblical Preaching. That's one of the books that we have a list of 25 books that every person in a doctoral program preaching has to have read. Wow. And Stott's book is one of those that we use. Because it helped create this metaphor of the bridge, preaching as a bridge between the ancient and the modern worlds. Yeah. And those kind of classic resources are things that preachers can still really benefit from. Somebody recently has actually done an update of that book. Has kind of tried to because some of the things that Stott talked about were certainly relevant to his time period, but technology has changed and some other things have changed. And so there's kind of an updated version of that book. But some of those great resources, I can go back and enjoy thumbing through an Andrew Blackwood book, and certainly John A. Broadus. Yes. Even on the preparation and delivery of sermons. Yeah. which was written in Greenville, South Carolina, about 30 minutes from our home, from our campus.
Way cool.
In fact, that's why we have the broadest lectures on preaching every fall that we offer at Anderson University. That have had some. We had Haddon Robinson did the first one. We've had people like Rick Warren, Michael Quick, Ralph West, Robert Smith that have done those lectures. So, so even though there are great new resources coming out, you never lose interest in the classics.
Sure.
You can always learn from those.
We're talking a little bit about technology. There is a controversial side to the technology and the resources and the availability of the material that is an ongoing discussion in preaching circles, and it's plagiarism, where it is not just benefiting from models. It is not just using these resources to sharpen your own thinking about text and sermons, but there are some who are just using material without the work. And people's thoughts and feelings are different about it at this stage. Just anything about that you care to comment on?
I talk with students about that on a regular basis. It's the downside. You know, every technology has an upside and a downside.
Sure.
This is one of the dangers for preachers. The ability to depend so fully on the works of others. And I know that there are pastors who say, hey, my work is out here, you know, if you want to, you know, use mine, you're welcome to do it. And I appreciate the spirit behind that. At the same time, I don't think it's good for I don't think it's good for the pastor to do that. The example I often give to students is that part of the strength that comes out of doing strong biblical preaching is the study. It's those hours in the study, digging through the text, looking at the commentaries. And what that does is it helps you as a pastor, as a preacher, to grow spiritually. It deepens, it matures you as a believer. And the problem is, if you spend all of your, if rather than doing that hard work of wrestling with the text, if you instead just simply pick up somebody else's sermons and perform them, because if you're just using somebody else's work, you're not really preaching. You're performing a script. And if you do that, at some point in your ministry, there's going to be that crisis point where you need to have a well of depth to draw on, and you won't have it because you haven't been wrestling with that text. You haven't been letting the Holy Spirit grow you as a believer and as a minister through that process of wrestling, of working with the text. If you skip it's like the old illustration of taking the chrysalis, you know, where the caterpillar has formed the chrysalis and is going to be a butterfly. You know, and the caterpillar, part of the strength of the butterfly to fly is working its way out of the chrysalis. If you take a penknife and open the chrysalis, the butterfly doesn't have to work. The butterfly won't have the strength to fly either. Same thing happens for pastors if they depend on the work of others rather than doing that hard work themselves.
Is preaching a gift you receive or a skill you learn, or both? And if both, where is the intersection between being a gifted preacher and learning the skill of preaching?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I think certainly it's a calling. There are people that probably could do a competent job, but God hasn't called them to do that. I think God calls each of us to do different things. For those that God calls to pastor, there's the old statement, you know, if you can do anything other than be a pastor, you should. But if you sense that fire in the bones, that God has called you, then you can't do anything else. And so I think that's an essential part of the preaching of the word, is that sense of call that God has put me here. Because there are times as a pastor, that's the only thing that's going to keep you there. You know, when you're dealing with struggles and issues and some rowdy deacons and all those other issues that happen in pastoral ministry. There'll be times that the only thing that'll hold you there is the fact that God put you there, and your assurance of that. But at the same time, God gives you natural gifts, but he also, I think, expects us to work with those gifts. I mean, you know, a farmer has land, but you have to work to develop that land, to cultivate it. And I think in the same way, we take the natural gifts God's given us, and we cultivate those. You know, we take advantage of education, of resources, materials, the work of others. Again, you know, plagiarism is a terrible thing, but it's not a terrible thing to learn and be inspired and encouraged by the work of others. I can learn. I learn from you. I learn from others as I see what you do in proclaiming the word, and I'll benefit from that. And that's a great educational experience. I think one of the sad things to me is to see someone who has been called to ministry and has great natural gifts, but they neglect the cultivation. They neglect the opportunity. They have an opportunity to go to school and learn, but they just decide to ride out on their natural gifts. I remember years ago, Gardner Taylor, I was doing an interview with Gardner Taylor, and he talked about, he kind of got thoughtful. He kind of stopped and he said, one of the concerns I have for the next generation is they look at guys like me and it looks easy. And they think, well, I can do that. And he said, what they don't realize is how many years of preparation and how many hours of study went into making it look easy. And so I think it's both. God calls us, he gives us the gifts, but he expects us to work with those gifts.
I had a similar experience hearing at one of your conferences, Dr. Robert Smith, and it was the first time I had heard him in person. And I so appreciated the message, but I was just as well as a preacher blown away by what I had just heard. And I stopped him afterward and asked him, how long did it take you to prepare that? And he told me 30 years.
That's right. That's right.
And you have to know Dr. Smith. That wasn't a brush off.
Oh, that's right.
He meant that with sincerity, and he was making a point, and I think it's an important point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what is your working definition of expositional preaching?
I have a particular, I'm actually working on a book right now.
Okay.
On application in preaching. I have a particular commitment that's come out of years of studying this, that exposition is the anointed application of a biblical text to the lives of the hearers. I think we sometimes, as expositors, make the mistake of thinking that our purpose is to transfer information from our heads to their heads. That's only a small piece of it. What's more important is, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, to communicate to the listeners the truth of a text and the implications of that text for our lives. And so I think that exposition is application. We do the exegetical work to understand the text, to be able to explain the meaning of the text. But then at the very heart of exposition is applying that text. What does this text mean in this culture, in our lives, in the life of a father and a mother and a business person and a doctor, all these different kinds of, identifying all these different kinds of ways that God's word speaks to our lives, the issues of our lives. So I think that's, to me, exposition is, I think sometimes we make the mistake of confusing exegesis and exposition. And I think we have pastors that consider themselves expositors. But what they're really doing is getting up every Sunday morning and putting their exegesis on parade. And they're not moving to that next essential step, which is not just what does the text mean, what does the text mean to us? Or getting across that bridge from Jerusalem to Jacksonville. That's right. That's right. It's easy to spend all of your time in ancient Israel. But we've got to be able to say, here's what it meant. You know, when Paul wrote that letter to the people at Corinth, here's how they would have heard it. But now let's take those principles and let's pull them over into the 21st century. How would those principles be applied in our time,
Sure.
in our day?
So what advice would you give for that next step? I will admit, I understand in my pastoral duty of biblical preaching that both the explanation and the application of the text is involved. There is a sense in which the textual part of this is, with all of the hard work of exegesis, easier because the text is fixed.
Yeah.
It means what it means.
Yeah.
It meant that when Paul wrote it, when David sung it, it means that today and 2,000 years from now. The application I find the challenge because that is a moving target that cannot be codified for all pastors.
Oh, yeah. What
that looks like from church to church, it's almost for a pastor like marriage.
Oh, yeah.
You can't give a list of principles from your marriage and apply it to everyone.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons why so many pastors, I think, tend to avoid it.
Yeah.
Is because it's the hardest thing
Sure.
that we do. I mean, as you say, the exegesis, there's clearly hard work that goes into it, but there are a lot of resources there.
Sure.
There are places to study. There are some great commentators who can help me to better understand the text.
Yeah.
But there's no commentator out there telling me how this passage applies, to Aunt Sue, or to Uncle Joe, or the people in my congregation. And that's my calling.
Yeah.
Is to be faithful in helping them both to understand what that text means and also understand what it means to them.
Yeah.
How would God apply to them? And so there is a lot of, obviously, dependence on the Holy Spirit. And I think a lot of it is opening our minds up to recognize that that's our calling.
Yeah.
That our calling is not simply to be students of the Word, but students of our people.
Yeah.
And to help to make that link together.
Sure.
It takes hard work.
Yeah. Would you feel comfortable mentioning preachers that you feel balance the two well?
Oh, well, I think, some of the preachers I love listening. I mentioned some of them earlier. People like Robert Smith, does a great job of that. I think Chuck Swindoll is a great example of that. I love to listen to him open up the text, but also does a great job of applying that.
Yeah.
I think people like Ralph West. I think Ralph does a good job with that. A lot of great preachers out there.
Sure. So, just throwing out those names, just two of those names. What would you say additionally to that? This kind of maybe gets me back to the called, gifted, skill thing. There are not very many men in this generation, in our lifetime, who are more skilled communicators in the pulpit than Chuck Swindoll. Ralph West. What would you say to the preacher who says, yeah, but that's Ralph West and that's Chuck Swindoll? Right. These are the LeBron Jameses of the pulpit.
That's right.
But some of these things are still the duties of every preacher. And for the average guy coming off the bench, for the walk-on who's not the first-round pick, what would be your advice there?
I would say, for one thing, remember that Chuck Swindoll didn't start out as Chuck Swindoll.
Yeah.
He went to school.
Sure.
He studied. He worked at it. Ralph West didn't start out doing what he does.
Yeah.
He's worked at it over the years. He's worked hard at that. He's gotten his education and things like that. Certainly there are natural gifts, but I think often where we sometimes miss the mark is that we don't develop the gifts we already have.
Yeah.
Develop the resources, that we have. We look at a Chuck Swindoll and say, oh, well, that's too much. And I guess the question we ought to ask ourselves as pastors, why is that too much? Why shouldn't we seek to have that level of exposition? May never make it, but I mean, how many kids are out there who can become great basketball players because they want to be like LeBron? Remember the old commercial, be like Mike?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, a lot of people became pretty good basketball players because they worked at it to try to be like Mike.
Yeah.
And so I think for all of us, it's that sense of let's take what God has given us and let's work it, let's develop it. And I won't ever be a Chuck Swindoll, but I can be the best Michael Diduit. Yeah, I can be. Yeah. You are a wonderful pastor. You're not Ralph West. Right. He's not H.B. Charles. Each of us needs to just be the best that God has made us and develop those skills that we have.
Yeah, that's great. One more question about preaching. As you are featuring preaching, teaching preaching, interviewing preachers, there is a resurgence in our day of expositional preaching, but there are many good preachers who are not expositors. And this also becomes a point of controversy and debate. But there are faithful preachers who would not go about their task the way, for instance, I do. As I am getting older, and I hope that means I'm getting more mature, I am learning more and benefiting more from men who don't do it the way I do it. But I could say, you are in a lane and you think this is the way, and particularly if you are committed to exposition as a student of expositional preaching. But we are living in a day where all around us God is blessing ministries and ministers who approach the task of preaching different. Any comment on that? I don't know where the question was, but
well, an illustration I've used before is when you buy a computer, when you take it out of the box, you don't have to create all the settings. There's some initial settings that are there. They're called the default settings. Now, if you need to change them, you can. Sure. But if you don't change them, there they are. The computer's going to operate based on those default settings. What I tell my students is, exposition ought to be your default setting. Wow. Sometimes you'll do something different. If I want to do a doctrinal series, then I'm not going to do exposition because I'm going to do, frankly, more systematic theology in the pulpit. Yeah. I'm going to be drawing from different passages and things like that, and that's perfectly legitimate. There's nothing wrong with doing that. If I may do a Christmas sermon that is not an exposition. I may want to do something special. A lot of times, a lot of revival sermons are that way, evangelistic sermons, and so there are reasons why we may want to do something more topically. I agree with you. I personally think exposition ought to be the default model for pastors. But there are preachers who are very effective and who are biblically faithful who don't do it that way. And that's okay. Yeah. I mean, frankly, you look at Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon did not do exposition the way we think of it. Sure. I think he sort of did okay.
Sort of, kind of, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you look at a lot of the great preachers through history. The way we think of exposition is really kind of mid-19th century on, and especially heavily in the later 20th century, as we kind of have crafted what we think of as an ideal approach to exposition. Yeah. But my goodness, there's 20 centuries of preaching prior to that, that I think some of them did okay. Yeah. And so I think it's dangerous to get narrow and think it has to be the way I I do it.
Yeah.
And there's some authors out there that do that. There's some preachers out there that say, oh, if you're not doing exposition, you're not being a faithful preacher.
Mm-hmm.
I don't agree with that.
Sure.
I think most of us do best if we primarily focus on exposition.
Mm-hmm.
But my goodness, I think you can be biblically faithful in a topical sermon.
Absolutely.
Now, the biggest issue that I would argue is to be cautious, because the danger of doing topical preaching versus expository preaching is it's easy to start preaching my ideas rather than God's ideas.
Mm-hmm.
If I basically come to the preaching task and say, I want to preach about this, I know what I already want to say. Now I just need to find a biblical text to illustrate my ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Well, who am I preaching?
Yeah.
I've begun preaching my ideas.
Right.
So that even in a topical sermon,
Mm-hmm.
I think the important thing is to make sure that we're biblically faithful.
Sure.
That we're staying with those biblical truths and preaching those rather than preaching, my thoughts, my imagination.
Sure. And one of the safeguards against that is treating the text in its context.
Absolutely.
And where topical preaching kind of unchains itself from that process,
That's right.
there are greater temptations.
That's right.
To draw my conclusions and find support for it.
Yeah, if you find yourself preaching an entire sermon on one word
Mm-hmm.
or one phrase,
Mm-hmm.
be careful.
Yeah.
Because what I may have done is pulled out a word that basically lets me say what I want to say,
Mm-hmm.
even though it really may not be true to that text.
Sure.
So the old saying, a text without a context is a pretext.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be careful that we don't do too much pretextual preaching.
Absolutely. So to wrap up, over the course of your ministry, you have been publishing, you have been in the academic world influencing preaching that way, but also annually, you have also led a conference.
Yes.
For those who may not know about that conference, would you tell us a little bit about its history and its purpose and what's coming up in this summer?
Yes, I will. We'd started Preaching Magazine in 1985, and at that time there were not a lot of conferences. These days, you could go to a pastor's conference every week if you wanted to. There's so many available. There just really were not a lot of conferences in those days, other than like denominational training events. And so with Preaching Magazine, with the success of the magazine, we said, maybe we could justify maybe every 2 or 3 years doing a conference event, a training event. So we did that very first one in 1989 in Tampa, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And it got such great response and such affirmation of preachers coming to us saying, can you do this again? We need this. That we said, well, let's, after that first one, I said, well, let's see if we can make it an annual event. And it became an annual event over the years. And we've had, many pastors from all over America and literally around the world that have come to be a part of that event. The National Conference on Preaching is the title that we use. Now, this year's, we did this conference here at your church a couple of years ago. This past year was in Washington, D.C. Next year, in 2018, it will be in May in Atlanta. But this year, this summer, we are doing the International Congress on Preaching in Cambridge, England. This will be the 4th international event. After we had done the National Conference on Preaching for a number of years, we started saying, wouldn't it be fun to be able to kind of every so often do it as an international event and make it easier for pastors from England and from Europe and other areas to be able to attend. And so we did the very first one in 1997 in Westminster Chapel in London.
Wow.
And I mean the chapel of Lloyd, the pulpit of Lloyd Jones and G. Campbell Morgan. Had a great time. John Stott came and preached for that one. And the George Carey, then the Archbishop of Canterbury, and had a great event. And so we got into a pattern of every 5 years being able to do that. We were at Edinburgh. 10 years ago, we were in Cambridge.
Wow.
And so we've in the process of not the magazine, but the conference changing hands and leaving the publisher and coming to the university. We skipped that 5th year, but now we're coming back to Cambridge, and it'll be August 8th through 10.
Yeah.
If somebody's interested in it, icop2017.com.
Great.
Is the website, and we've got a great lineup, including you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Got Ralph West, Robert Smith, Dave Stone is going to be there. Herschel York is going to be there. Charlie Dates. Just a great team of pastors and speakers that are going to be a part of that event.
That's great. If someone wanted to subscribe to Preaching Magazine, how would they do that?
Well, even as you and I speak, the magazine is about to change hands. It's been published for the last 10 years by Salem Communication. They are in the process right now, in fact, as of next week, as you and I speak, that Anderson University is about to become the owner and publisher of Preaching Magazine. So if somebody's interested in doing it, they could write to us at ministry@andersonuniversity.edu, or within a few weeks, there'll be a new website up, preachingmagazine.org.
Yeah.
That'll be available, and we look forward to continuing and now kind of regrowing the magazine under the auspices of the Clamp Divinity School and Anderson University.
That is great. You mentioned that you are working on a book. You have published previous works. Would you mention those titles to us?
Well, a couple of those books are collections of interviews from the magazine, and those are they're not in print anymore, but they're available still as ebooks. Communicate with Power, Preaching with Power. The book that is in print, Handbook of Contemporary Preaching, is a collection of essays. We're actually working on developing a second edition of that. That book will soon be 20 years old, and so we're working on developing a new edition with some new contributors and things like that. I'll be calling you.
Okay.
And so the Handbook of Contemporary Preaching is available on that. And I'm actually now working on the collection of the third interviews book.
Oh, great.
Which we'll hopefully have out within a couple of years.
That is great. Wow. Well, I thank you for your friendship, and I thank you for your work, and I thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. And remember, this fall, September 19 through 21, 2017, we'll host the Cutting It Straight Expository Preaching Conference here at the Shiloh Church in Jacksonville, Florida. For more information, go to cutstraight.org. Thanks again for watching.